The limitations, as you've outlined in the question, itself indicates that the global headwinds are certainly not very supportive. Trade has shrunk, and therefore that shrinking trade has an impact. How long this regime of low commodity, mineral, oil prices will last. And most economies are facing their own challenges. I think the essential silver lining for India in this environment, as far as the global picture is concerned, the challenges of unpredictability, volatility remaining, one thing we must realize that we are not so integrally integrated with the Chinese manufacturing or the distribution chain. But having said that, it's a very large economy, and therefore its impact will be there globally. And I'm conscious of that impact in India. The low oil price regime is the key silver lining as far as India is concerned in this. And I think domestically within India, this has helped us to maintain basic macroeconomic parameters which seem to be in reasonably good shape. The growth rates are at a reasonable level. Our fiscal deficit, our current account deficit is at a reasonable level. Inflation is broadly under control. The interest rate movement at least is in the right direction. And foreign exchange reserves are high. And I think there are several factors which are contributing to India's growth story itself. The lower oil prices have helped us to save a lot of money, divert a lot of money to areas where we need to spend on. So if you look at the economy of all the states in India, most states are doing reasonably well. Their fiscal position is good. A lot of them are taken up infrastructure projects on their own. The central government has enhanced the infrastructure spending. We've enhanced our spending as far as the rural areas are concerned. And public spending is able to maintain a lot of strength in the economy itself. Secondly, I think the global options being what they are, international investors also find India a good destination today. And that's why our foreign direct investments are at a level which is probably one of the highest in recent years. There is a significant improvement as far as urban demand is concerned. And I think all these factors taken together, coupled with the kind of increased infrastructure spending, rural spending, the possibility seems likely that we'll be able to maintain the kind of growth rates or even marginally improve upon them that we've maintained in the last 2 years. So to maintain a 7% plus, 7.5% plus minus growth rate in the midst of a global slowdown is reasonably well. I've always believed that when the world is doing well, everybody does well. But the challenging situation is to maintain some level of growth when the world is facing challenging situations. And I think from that point of view, we've been able to show a considerable amount of resilience.
Thank you very much for that, that response. One of the questions which many foreign investors particularly have asked is that this far-reaching budget of yours, which has this remarkable virtue of not only sticking to the path of fiscal rectitude and moving towards perhaps an act which really meets current macroeconomic environment, many of them want to ask that there is a daunting legislative agenda ahead of the government, particularly some of the things outlined in your budget, the bankruptcy bill which has been introduced, and some other important legislations like the financial code which have been mentioned. And considering the fact that your fabled skills in being able to traverse the difficult complications of parliamentary management is something which is being talked about, how sanguine and how optimistic are you?
Parliamentary system, with or without some amendments, even if delayed, legislations are always passed. I think that's the strength of India's parliamentary democracy. And now if you look at the agenda ahead, let me clarify, a large number of actions are taken really in the first instance by executive action also. There is no problem, it's only the determination of the government to go ahead with them. Secondly, several legislations require approval of the lower house only, particularly the money bills, etc. So when you speak in terms of direct tax reforms, these are all reforms which actually require only the lower house approval, and therefore I don't think there is any form of obstruction which is possible in that agenda, as long as the government itself is clear-headed and determined to go ahead. Now, what are the legislations before Parliament? Laws like insurance, mining, coal, Aadhaar, we've already put them behind us. I think the easiest under the circumstances and the obvious one is the bankruptcy law. And considering that there is a huge amount of support for the idea that you can't allow banks with such high levels of NPAs. The government is doing its best, the banks are doing their best to bring them down, but at the same time an exit law must also be a reasonable one. I think I'm reasonably optimistic that all sections of Parliament are going to support the bankruptcy law. That seems to be the available indication itself. There's a second important piece of legislation which I introduced on the last day of the last session, which was actually to make business easier. There were some complicated procedures which had been introduced in 2013 in the Companies Act. We are trying to modify a large number of them. That will go to the standing committee, and whatever is the consensus in the standing committee, I think we'll adopt it. So that really leaves you only with the goods and services tax. I think it now coming down really to only one issue. The only opponents of the goods and services tax, the Congress party, curiously the party which had sponsored the law in the first instance, has some belated wisdom that you must have a constitutional cap. Now that seems a little difficult. So I am going to be discussing with them. I am all for the idea of having a reasonable rate as far as the GST is concerned, which the GST Council itself will decide. I have no difficulty with that, but I hope with some consensus on that reasonable rate between the two national parties, we are able to arrive at a more consensual approach.
Finance Minister, before I request my colleagues to come in, my last question is, one of the areas which has attracted international attention is a state...
You see, the two obvious reasons for an unacceptable higher level of NPAs. Now, I won't get into the estimates of how much there are because the RBI is looking at it and insisting on transparent balance sheets so that everything is provisioned. I think one is the losses which occur on account of the business environment in a particular sector. Now, these are business-related NPAs. So when the cycle reverses, the NPAs also are capable of getting reversed. The others are loans which were, let's say, given without an adequate amount of due diligence. and which are the more problem areas. Now, fortunately, most of our NPAs are in the earlier category. And these are all related, if you look at it, to the stress in particular sectors. Now, regrettably, these sectoral problems had not been addressed. And the government, besides going in for recapitalization, professionalizing management, setting up the bank board bureau, going in for a long-term agenda of consolidation, despite, notwithstanding all these policy steps, I think one of the key things that we have done is to address each one of the sectors. So the largest was steel. We've taken significant steps, and I'm told we are now going through various, the next 1 or 2 quarters, as far as steels are concerned, the balance sheets are going to start looking better. The highways was paralyzed completely. Things are much better. Sugar was a stressed industry. Fortunately, the global prices have moved up, so sugar, also a series of steps taken by the government, has significantly improved. Power sector stress, the root cause was the health of the state discoms. We've adequately addressed that. Most of the states have come forward and have signed the MOU with the center, and that sectoral reform is on. Stalled projects and dispute resolution, a series of steps have been taken as far as that area is concerned. So addressing each sector one by one. There are still some sectors which need to be properly addressed. I think as the economy improves and the global environment improves, coupled with these sectoral resolutions itself, you'll start seeing the impact on the bank balance sheets by themselves.
Thank you. Claude, I think that, can I request you, if you want to make any comment or ask any question?
I've been struggling for the last 2 years. If somebody could make me wiser on what constitutes Big Bang. So I've repeatedly asked this question of people to tell me what are the 3 Big Bang ideas. And they've all promised to get back to me, but I'm still waiting for the first big suggestion. So I think if I had an option of a career, I'd probably be a television anchor or a column writer. So you can use the phrase Big Bang and without having the responsibility of defining what constitutes Big Bang. Now, if you look at what really seems to have happened in India in the last 2 years, and don't forget one fact, I don't consider it a negative or a liability. I think it's a great asset. We are a large democracy, probably the noisiest democracy in the world, and therefore you have to deal with every step very carefully, and therefore you have to find out a road for yourself for every measure that you take. Now, if you cumulatively take all the steps which have been taken, how would you define them? The government first decided that there are various sectors which need to be opened up. So both by legislation and by executive action, we opened up those sectors. Then in the past opening out, there had been some difficult conditionalities. We removed the conditionalities in many of the cases. We simplified the procedures. Next comes a situation, what is the kind of environment that you create for decision making? Firstly, you have to be decisive. And secondly, India had a huge backlog in trying to correct its image that decisions can be taken with an honest motivation in India. And I think freeing Indian decision making from the curse of corruption was an important responsibility of the government. And therefore we moved in that direction. That also eases your environment for doing business. So today, probably my office in North Block is the most deserted office in the government of India because nobody comes pushing for files. Nobody comes pushing for FIPP clearances. Nobody goes to the Environment Ministry pushing for environmental clearances. So these are all decisions which under the Prime Minister's directions are now being taken in routine, and the decisions are all taken expeditiously. Thirdly, I think we've generated a lot of competition amongst the states in India. So every state is trying to present a package that, well, I am a better investment destination. And therefore, they come out with these investment proposals. You don't have now to lobby with ministers for policy or for, let's say, natural resources. You sit wherever in the world and you can bid whenever the bids open up. So that's a clean, transparent system we've introduced. As far as taxation is concerned, we've started this whole process of making India's direct taxes globally competitive. In fact, on the individual side, we are much better off than most developed parts of the world. Our rates are much more reasonable and attractive. The corporate tax also is being made one of the most attractive one in the world. Therefore, our direct taxes are on, and this is work in progress, this is not work completed yet, are in the right direction. Indirect taxes, we are trying to make the situation very reasonable once the GST itself is passed. Next, if you come to various reforms and if you see ministry after ministry, the kind of activity which has now taken place in the power ministry, the kind of activity which is taking place in the mining ministry, the kind of activity which is taking place in oil and the gas sector, etc., there have been significant movements which have taken place in each one of these sectors. And then, as far as government expenditure is concerned, we've stuck to the discipline, enhanced expenditure, and we are trying to put government resources where resources are required the maximum. That's agricultural sector and rural India, as also the infrastructural sector. Now, that's going to be the direction of the reform. I think the most important fact is, whether you call it Big Bang or you call it a series of incremental reforms which taken together are much more than Big Bang, or alternatively, I think this government is yet to commit its first mistake as far as the economic policy is concerned. All steps it has taken place are in one direction, and slowly and surely you are moving in that direction, carrying the democratic opinion along with it. I think one of the great successes has been that today India doesn't face any political opposition to reforms. That's because India is becoming more aspirational, people are feeling the benefits of the reform process, and carrying that section of opinion along with you, I think was a big challenge which we've succeeded in doing so.
Thank you. Naushad would like to ask a question.
Sure.
A series of questions. How can we add to the growth rate? That seems to be your first point. I think the growth rates will always be relatable to how supportive the global environment is. So if the global tailwinds are behind you, they're capable of pushing you a little ahead. It's when the global headwinds are obstructive and still to grow, that's a little more challenging, and that's what the current situation we are in. I think what are the eventualities possible in which you can improve upon this 7.5% growth rate, given the situation what it is? So I think there are some factors, the global situation, I think, if we can count it out, because it's not a factor under our control. I think there are 3 or 4 domestic responses for which we must be ready. The first really is, I think, this year, it's still not clear as to what the state of the monsoons is going to be. It's again a factor beyond our control because a lot of our land is rain-fed. If you have a good monsoon, I think the weakest link in the in the GDP itself gets a boost. And I think products which have a lot of sale in the rural areas with the rural purchasing power improving itself will be impacted. I think that is one factor, that's one variable. Besides the global situation, that's the second variable. The third, which is something which is entirely in our control. I think to keep this impact of public spending on rural India and physical infrastructure, I think we have to maintain it, we have to increase it, and it's extremely important because this itself is one factor which is helping a lot of growth. Keeping our doors wide open, easing our systems, attracting as much foreign direct investment. Because if India's private sector is a little slow at the moment because of its overstretched situation, investment must come from where it's available. And therefore, global investors are also looking for global options. And a fast-growing economy is always going to be high up on their agenda. And I think it's here that your first and your third question are interlinked. When they all look at us, given our past track record, particularly 2004 to 2014, a legitimate question comes into their mind: can India sustain this direction itself? And I think India needs a larger consensus where all of us, including my party or any other party, we stands won't depend on where you sit in parliament. For instance, I am faced with a reversal of position when I accept some of the moves which the Congress party itself started. And therefore, this whole idea of putting corporate tax down to 25% was included in the direct tax code which Mr. Chidambaram had mooted. The idea of GST was first mooted by Mr. Chidambaram and then introduced by the present president when he was the finance minister. And there is no point taking a reversal as far as those issues are concerned. And therefore, you see, for instance, take a stand which a leading member of the opposition has taken. Well, we want a GST which is capped at 18%, a fair stand. Whether you put it in the constitution or through a GST council, you have 18%, but that rate, I have no quarrel with that rate. But then the next day you go around and say, keep luxury items out of taxation, which means the luxury items must be subsidized by the essential items. And the GST itself moves up. I am then reminded of President Clinton's famous comment on the economy itself. You can't create a situation where GST moves up into 20s by keeping luxury items out and then say, no, now maintain it at 18%. And therefore, I think there is a greater need for a mature level of both thought and discussion as far as these issues are concerned. I have, of course, raised this issue, and this is not a problem which is specific to India. As I travel around the world, I see a lot of democracies having it. To what extent our upper house is going to be used to block economic decision making? Mr. Rudd is here, so he knows what's happening in his country, Australia. The same debate is on. The United Kingdom went through this debate decades ago. I'm told Italy is having the same debate because ultimately these decisions have the weight of a directly elected house will always have to be maintained.
Thank you. Jamshed, you want to ask a question?
Thank you, NK. Mr. Finance Minister.
Well, urbanization is a reality. Some people, like the former president, President Abdul Kalam, had mooted an alternative model where he wanted urban-like facilities in rural areas. Now, I think going ahead, India has to really live with a combination of both. The simple factor being that agriculture won't be able to sustain 50 to 60% of your people. And therefore, a lot of people are going to move out of agriculture. They are going to run to places where there is economic activity, and that's going to be urban centers. You already have states like Punjab, Haryana, Gujarat, Maharashtra, which have become more than 50% urban. And this trend is going to continue across the country. Now, when this trend continues, do you allow haphazard urbanization, or do you allow a structured kind of an urbanization? What seems to be happening at the moment is that there have been few structured new cities which have come in. Gandhinagar came up, New Raipur is coming up, Noida is coming up. These are structured, well-planned new cities. The alternative model was that around big urban centers, you had suburban townships which came up, which are also reasonably structured. The third category is worrisome, where people created an urban center because they needed cheap places to live in. I think the third category has to be completely avoided. And this is going to be primarily the responsibility of the state governments. When you have these highways coming up, these industrial corridors coming up, there's a huge opportunity to set up structured urban centers where you can have, subject to water availability. Fortunately, power availability is going to increase in this country. Dependence on renewable solar in all these centers could also be there. Waste managements could be planned in an adequate way. I think I don't know whether many of us have visited, though it's a small center, but I think what could be a real role model is the manner in which the gift city in Gandhinagar has been created. So even though it's much smaller in size, but it's probably the state-of-the-art facilities as to what a new township should really look like. And if other states also emulate that model and create centers of this kind, I think it will be a great achievement. You see, legal reforms, the challenge before legal reforms is that governments can legislate. The legal reforms are to be implemented by the judges themselves. And therefore, unless a large part of that reform or implementing is decided by the judicial institution. For instance, I remember when I was the law minister, with much fanfare, I amended in Parliament the Code of Civil Procedure. And if every timeline I mentioned in the Civil Procedure Code had been adhered to, in 12 to 14 months, a case could get over. That would be the normal life. Now, when we lay down statutory time limits, if the executive doesn't follow them, it will be strictured by the government. But now these were timelines for the judicial institution. So immediately a judgment came, these are directory and not mandatory. And therefore the cases will still go on as long as it's possible. So I think unless it's not merely Parliament, governments have the responsibility of giving more money, better infrastructure, creating more courts. And I think we'll need more courts, but at the end of the day, that expedition really has to come from the bar, it has to come from the bench itself. Well, I can't dispute your last point on we need economic activity. You need, your level of development is that big industrialization in India is still to take place. Big urbanization phase is still to come. Jobs are still to be generated. Everybody still has to be provided with electricity. And therefore, all this will have an adverse impact on environment as this activity grows. But the fact is, how do we minimize that damage? And how do we allow our economy and ecology to coexist? I think even though our crying needs of development are there, I think as a responsible global player, we've been doing our bit. And if you see, even in terms of fiscal planning, the amount of carbon we are taxing, whether it's oil or it's coal, the largest program in the world to get onto renewable energy, I think that's a part of India's movement in balancing our developmental needs while maintaining the ecology. Of course, some of our urban centers, particularly the city we are in at the moment, Mumbai, extremely badly impacted, and therefore we have to put our house in order as far as these areas are concerned.
Thank you. Finance Minister has kindly agreed to take some interventions from the floor or find out if the former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Kevin Rudd, would like to make any intervention.
Like your response on the question of define a big bang for me. This is a universal question posed to incoming governments in every democratic jurisdiction that I've had any experience of. But speaking of big bangs, let me go to the question which hasn't been part of the discussion this morning. If we want a definition of what a big bang is not, it is probably called the World Trade Organization. Pardon me for being brutal. But looking at the world from India's perspective, and given the matters that we'll discuss in the next session on if global trade liberalisation is going nowhere fast, which is true, and the index of protectionist measures taken by...
For asking for India's broad approach as far as global trade is concerned. You see, through the 80s and the 90s, or at least the early part of the 90s, I think India's interests were predominantly defensive. We were unsure of ourselves because we just started liberalizing as to whether at all we can become a competitive player as far as the world is concerned. And many in India thought that opening out itself would create a situation where our own industry won't grow. And as in most developing economies, we had the fear of the unknown. I think there was parallelly another major change taking place. From the initial impression that the big developed part of the world, which means United States, North America, the European Union, they will dominate global trade. I think from that a situation started transforming itself where globalization was now acquiring a new meaning. And that altered meaning was that consumers across the world are now going to look for goods and services which are of good quality but at the most competitive price. And that actually, in one sense, changed the whole global scenario. The emergence of low-cost manufacturing countries, they started dominating the manufacturing scene. We weren't able to make an impact there. But I think as far as low-cost services were concerned, we were able to make a much greater impact. And I think in the last decade, the developed world also started losing a lot of interest in the Doha development round. And because the WTO was a rule-based organization which would resolve international trade disputes, you could get into areas like trade facilitation and so on, but your agreements on manufacturing on services, I think that went into a slower gear. That having happened, the global trade won't stop, and therefore your specific tie-ups, regional tie-ups, plurilateral tie-ups between countries now has started. Whether the Doha development round is now over, it should be abandoned, or it should be continued, India has a strong position, it should be continued and taken to its logical conclusion. I think one important change which has taken place from a very, very defensive player, whether it's the environmental negotiations or it's the trade negotiation, I think India's confidence in negotiation has also improved. And therefore, I don't think India is now really scared of that unknown scenario. And therefore, India enters these negotiations with a more open mind, with a greater sense of confidence. And we'd like the multilateral trade bodies to be taken to their logical conclusion, the Doha Development Round. That's our preferred option. We've expressed it. At the same time, various other tie-ups which are taking place, depending on what the interest of our own economy is, I think we are fairly open to them now. And you can't claim to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world and then not think of trade as a win-win option. I think there is a huge change in the last 15 to 20 years which has taken place as far as India's approach is concerned. It's a transformation, and it's a transformation which is more positive and for the better.
Mr. Taniguchi, Special Advisor to
Prime Minister Rudd has already asked, but nonetheless, may I ask you a similar question in the following way? If one looks at economic narratives that are increasingly in vogue in the US and in Europe, if not in my country of Japan, globalization has...
I just explained when I was responding to Prime Minister Rudd. I think we've significantly grown out of that situation. There would still be conservative sections of opinion which would voice that, but it's a reality. And I think the reality that both in, particularly in services, we have a fairly aggressive approach. And the idea that we must not miss out on this last opportunity we have for even low-cost manufacturing, and therefore be more and more competitive as far as the world is concerned, our wages still being quite reasonable. There's an opportunity that we smell in this. And I think the element of that anti-globalization, I think that phase we seem to have grown out of now.
Thank you, Ambassador Weisner. We know...
Make a final comment on that, because till the government takes a positive decision, but all I can say is that it's an important way station, as you mentioned, and I hope we halt in the direction on that way station itself, because I would see India being open to the idea, and therefore between now and November, I think is a crucial period to negotiate the step that you have in mind.
Thank you. We are happy to have a significant presence.
China unquestionably as one of the largest and a very fast-growing economy in the world. The fact that China for almost 3 decades grew at an unprecedented growth rate of 9 to 10%, I think is a great achievement for any country. And therefore, the model that China followed, I think there is a lot of entrepreneurs in India who have to learn from that model. And obviously, being a country in the same region and amongst the 2 most populated countries in the world, which had to pull up a lot of people out of poverty, India can't ignore that reality of China. China, for the last so many years, has almost shouldered 50% of the global growth. And therefore, even with new Chinese normals in terms of growth having come down, I think for an economy of that size, even moderate levels of growth are big enough. And therefore, China is in some sense a natural trading partner with India because of geographical proximity and various factors. Notwithstanding old political histories, I think in the last 1.5, 2 decades, China and India, in terms of being economic partners, have come quite close to each other. And in fact, the relationship motivated significantly by businesses and the economy itself has added to an improved climate in the overall relationship between the two countries. I think from that point of view, Chinese investment in India, India's investment in China, Indians have gone up and also set up plants and factories in China because of better prospects in that country, I think is welcome. And therefore, most of Chinese investments have been welcome as far as India is concerned. If there are any specific issues, there would be reason for it. I'm not going into any specific investment at the moment, but by and large, India has a very positive approach as far as China trading with, doing business with China is concerned. India's currency over the last one and a half years, where global currencies were facing a lot of volatility, was by and large stable. Till August last year, that's when the Chinese currency significantly moved and got devalued. Till that moment, we had almost kept pace and parity with the US dollar. The dollar had strengthened. Subsequent to that, we lost a significant amount and then recovered a little bit. Qua other currencies in the world, we were still strong. And I think India's currency is finding its own level. And I don't see a very serious challenge. Of course, if some significant movements in currency globally take place, the US rates, etc., there is some movement, but I think eventually after an initial impact, our currency has shown, at least twice in the last 3 years, a tendency to recover.